Well, greetings and welcome, everyone. For those of you who I don't know, I'm Arthur Romano. I'm an associate professor and lead faculty member for the Urban Peacebuilding program at the Carter School at George Mason University. And I want to thank each and every one of you for making the time today, for taking some time out on your lunch break to join us. We're looking forward to your input and questions in this session, and also just to your engagement with this work over the long haul. So feel free to reach out to us if this sparks something inside of you today, or if you have something that that we can learn from and grow with. We're very interested in hearing from you. And I'm excited to introduce our panelists. I've been waiting for this for a while, and I'm personally also had an opportunity to see each of the people who are here today, the work they do, and very glad for them making the time to be here. It's an accomplished group of scholars and practitioners, and also importantly, people who bridge that divide and bridge many worlds in their work. But before I introduce the panelists, I just thought I'd like to introduce the focus of the session a little bit, provide some framing for our conversation today. And we're really focused on the possibilities for developing more robust peace-building systems in cities. And the goal is not to try to figure out some kind of plan, direct plan, or single roadmap, but rather to kind of envision possible trajectories, to think about peace building and peace in our cities more deeply, to think about it maybe sometimes more broadly and more holistically. So a key part of that discussion is going to be talking about violence and how do we prevent violence. And we have panelists today who are doing deep work, not just in terms of addressing violence today, but looking at the deep historical legacy that creates many of the biggest challenges and difficult situations that we face. And we're also going to be looking at how we can build systems that just help us live together in ways that are more sustainable and more just and healthy. So proactively working to lift each other up, to be able to create cities and spaces in our communities where people's gifts and their strengths can flourish, and where we can really kind of harness in many ways and continue to unleash the power of what happens in cities, where people come from sometimes all corners of the globe, where we have a kind of level of connection, potential for connection that is unique. And also the world is changing. More and more people live in cities. The overwhelming majority of people who live on the planet are in urban contexts. So this is very much both in terms of the opportunity and the challenge, what lies in front of us in our future. So I'm, as I said, really excited to get this conversation kicked off, and in a way we're freed up from trying to needing to have a singular solution, but more some food for thought today in thinking about, if we're thinking about things a little bit more systematically, what's possible in our city. So I'm going to introduce our panelists and ask them to briefly share about their work to start us off. And our panelists bring a broad range of expertise, and we intentionally wanted to bring people together today on the panel that are concerned with and working on different but interrelated areas and different issues. So we're going to begin with Ms. Pat Gunn, who is joining us from, are you in Savannah today, Ms. Pat?
Yes, I'm in Savannah, yes.
Savannah, Georgia. Ms. Pat's a master Gullah Geechee storyteller with a focus on the African-American journey from slavery to freedom. She's the National Policy Fellow for the Truth Telling Project. She's also the Executive Director and co-founder of the Susie King Taylor Center at Savannah, Georgia. She has a lot of inspiring material online too that you can check out. And if you want to deepen your exploration of the issues that she is invested so much of her life in sharing with the world and collecting in terms of oral history. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Miss Pat, to just, if you could, give the folks who are with us today a sense. We're going to just do a brief kind of introduction, 5 minutes or so, of the work you're doing, and maybe a bit of what that kind of looks like in practice.
Thanks so much. I'm so honored to be here, and I am a daughter of the soil of Georgia. I live on the coast of Georgia now, but I did 30 years in Atlanta working for, I think, one of the most empowering social justice organizations in the nation, and that was the American Civil Liberties Union. I learned a lot on that journey, and what I've done is taken what I've learned in the 30 years in Atlanta, and I brought them back to the coast of Georgia. And so what I saw in the 20th century definitely is connectional to peace building. I saw the post-civil rights generation. I saw them do agitation, agitating America. Something is wrong. We're not getting equity. We have these laws on the books. The 1964 Civil Rights Act, we have desegregation that's not working. So I saw the post-civil rights generation agitate America. I saw them educate America, and then I saw them educate America. And I think that's all part of the peace building. I think fast forward for me in this work in Savannah, it's on the coast of Georgia. It's the last port of entry for slavery in America. And what I see here is that the redaction of the history is causing trauma, and it's causing pain, and it's causing poverty, and poverty leads to anger, and anger leads to criminal justice problems. And so what I'm sharing is that the methodologies of the 20th century, agitate, educate, and organize, must be brought into the new century, I believe, with a mixture of truth-telling, reconciliation, healing, and repair for the damages that we have done in this country. And we have to have the right tools. So I'm most interested in peace building. I think there are different definitions that people bring to the table. But for me, based on the fact that you're looking at a daughter of the soil that's drank from colored water fountains in Savannah when I was growing up, or having to stand to windows called service windows to get foodways because we're not allowed in, I think peace building perhaps has to do with the principles of either negative peace building or positive peace building or just peace. And so I'm interested in joining in this conversation about peace building and seeing how we can make that a part of the 21st century victory. So just honored to be with you this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. We're honored to have you with us today. Ms. Pat, I'm supposed to wait to ask questions, but I can't help myself in this case. Could you give folks a glimpse into, because you've done so much work and over an impressive time period, what are, when in terms of the healing and repair and the acknowledgement of past harm that you pointed out is so key to thinking about peace building? Is there certain practices? What are the practices that you've had a chance to use? I know just from the times that we've had conversations about your work that spans a wide range of activities. But if you don't mind just kind of giving folks a window into what are some of those activities that help with that acknowledgement of history and with that healing and repair.
Yes, so when I returned, and thank you for the question, when I returned to Savannah after being away so long, I realized that the history of slavery and freedom had been redacted. You won't find any signage downtown. You have burial grounds. You have John C. Calhoun on top of public squares. And so we've been victorious of getting the public square of John C. Calhoun's name removed last November. And just last month on the 24th of August, we have a brand new square. It's called the Susie King Taylor Square, and it's for the first African-American woman who was the first nurse in America on the Union side, and the first woman named square in 140 years. And so we reflect on the methodology, and what I said to them was, I think we entered that discussion with dignity. We formed some solidarity with our coalition building from people from all walks of life. And I believe that we held on to our humility. It's like when we did those three things, then magic began to happen. So I would say those are the three things that we use: dignity, which meant that I was not willing to compromise everything. It's like they wanted to put Susie King Taylor on the square with John C. Calhoun. And we said, no, it has to be, she's going to stand alone as a systematic voice of positive energy, or we just won't do it. And then we stood in the solidarity with everybody else there that we'd already educated. And then we kept our humility so that people knew that you don't have to turn to violence to get it done. So I would say those three things: dignity, solidarity, and humility is what kept us strong for the victory.
Thank you. Yeah, that really helps show the grounded nature of the work. I appreciate that. So next we're going to have Ashton Romer, who's a PhD candidate and works with the Urban Peacebuilding program and is a peace engineering fellow. And Ashton and I work closely together. Her research is helping to kind of move our field toward a focus on transportation, and is driven by an understanding that our cities are ill-served by the supremacy of cars and motivated by the belief that reimagining streets to meet the needs of the public would create more peaceful communities. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Ashton, to talk about the transportation piece of peace building.
Thanks, Arthur. So as I was prepping for this session, I watched some videos of my fellow panelists presenting in other spaces, and I'm truly humbled to be speaking alongside such extraordinary leaders that are pushing the world to more truthful, just, and peaceful futures with such clarity, conviction, and class. So thank you to Arthur for inviting me to be part of a discussion that I will learn so much from, and much gratitude to the folks in the audience who are present today. So as Arthur mentioned, my name is Ashton Romer. I'm a PhD candidate at the Carter School, and I'm researching vehicular violence, the conflict system of car supremacy, and streets as sites of social movement and peace building. Before I dive into the work that I do, I want to frame up the issue because not everyone has the same picture of it as I do. I call it vehicular violence because every year in the US, there are 45,000 deaths on our roads, which runs neck and neck with deaths due to gun violence. This is an epidemic with tragic consequences for Black and Brown folks who make up a disproportionate share of the 25% of American adults who is transportation insecure, meaning they can't get where they need to go with the resources they have. While I encounter my own share of harassment as a woman moving in the public sphere, as a white person, I don't have to fear for my life when I'm out biking and walking because of racialized and brutal policing practices that Black and Brown folks have to contend with every time they set out on foot or on two wheels. Beyond this possibility of police brutality, pedestrians and cyclers of color have to calculate the risks of unsafe roadways. So Black Americans die at more than 4 times the rate of white Americans while cycling, and more than 2 times more than walking. Hispanic walkers and cyclers face death rates of 1.5 and 1.7 times as high, respectively. American Indian and Alaska Natives are 4.8 times more likely to die while walking than any other race or ethnic group. Add to that tens of thousands of premature deaths due to pollution caused by the transportation sector, which is again disproportionately in communities of color. Add to that millions of injuries. Add to that tens of millions of lives disrupted, whether it's because folks who are involved in car crashes find that they can't participate in society the same way that they used to be able to, or because their loved ones have to shoulder care burdens, or because people have to live with whatever trauma they've experienced, or either being in a car crash themselves or witnessing someone get hit by a car. Add to that the other public health impacts of our dependence on cars, whether it's the negative effects of noise pollution or less active lifestyles or fewer opportunities for social interaction. This doesn't even begin to capture the Black and Blood neighborhoods destroyed for highways, shuttling affluent white suburban commuters into the hearts of our cities, the number of people who are threatened just trying to get to the store via human-powered mobility, or any of the other myriad ways that we experience these cycles of harm on our streets. And that's where my second bit on the conflict system of car supremacy comes into play. Because of how we constructed and reconstructed our built environment, which is in large part thanks to more than a century of lobbying efforts of many industries that are incentivized to make cars a dominant form of transportation, we've been socialized to not think of this as a giant, interconnected, inherently violent conflict system. It's even in our language. When we call something that can be predicted with a lot of accuracy because we know what conditions cause them, when we call those things an accident instead of a crash, We are ignoring the fact that we are forced to be reliant on a street network that has been designed and engineered to prioritize speed and convenience for some, rather than safety and accessibility for all. When you consider that most of the country has to pay $10,000 a year through car maintenance and operating costs to merely participate in society because they have no other option, at which point we are locked into a vicious conflict system where such participation necessitates, at the very least, the disadvantage of others, and in some cases, perhaps even the sacrifice of their lives. It is undeniable, to me at least, that we are involuntarily complicit in an unjust system that touches on nearly every aspect of our society. Once you see it, you can't unsee it, nor can you stop finding new ways it permeates our world. The work I do is spread over a few different spaces, and this is where I can tie in streets as sites of social movement and peace building. I'm a hyperlocal volunteer part-time elected official who ran to change the discourse in this space after I heard someone in the role that I have now call protected bike lanes ageist and sexist. They are not. I'm an activist who pushes to overhaul our policies and transform our built environment by starting a bike bus and filing so many 311 requests and pestering government agencies and testifying at council hearings in a humble pursuit to rebalance the power structures that, unbeknownst to us, organize much of our social interaction, I would say, for the worse. I also volunteer with a local organization called Families for Safe Streets, where I've been building a map to memorialize people killed in car crashes. What takes up most of my time, though, is toiling away on my research along the many spokes of this systemic issue and using my privileged platform as an academic to get people curious about what comes to mind when they envision more peaceful streets. So with that, I will turn it back to Arthur. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashton. I appreciate you also bringing in the pieces of how inequality manifests in that transportation system too, and the ways that we're kind of locked in given our current circumstances and even the built physical infrastructure. Folks, if you are kind of absorbing this food for thought, I see people nodding, and for the people I don't see, I imagine different reactions. So if you have a question that comes up in the process of this discussion, put it in the chat. That's just good for everybody to get a chance to see how people are thinking about this. We might not have a chance to talk through every question, but it helps inform our thinking. So please, as people are speaking, if you have questions, write them into the chat. Our next speaker is Dr. Michael Schenk, and he's the Director of Engagement at the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, a group of international cities committed to achieving aggressive long-term carbon reduction goals. Michael's professional career includes leading press and/or policy shops at the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, Climate Nexus, U.S. Congress Friends Committee on National Legislation, the Institute for Economics and Peace, Biodiversity Northwest, and the Puget Sound Soundkeeper Alliance, and other organizations. Dr. Schenk, Michael, if you could please tell us a little bit about your work and some of the practices that are key to doing that work in relation to peace building in cities.
Thanks, Arthur. It's good to be here with everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. And I want to echo what Ashton was saying in terms of the panel gathered. I feel honored to participate in this conversation. I put a few links in chat. If you scroll up now, there's some chat about whether or not this will be shared out as a video, which it will, which is good. But above that, I put 2 links to my organizations, the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance and the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, as well as 2 articles I wrote recently on how our cities are approaching communities differently. And so you may wonder why someone who works on sustainability or carbon neutrality might be in a conversation about violence prevention, but it is very much at the fore of our work. And I'll just attend to that very briefly before we get into conversation. So years ago, I spent some time working on the Global Peace Index and the US Peace Index, which I know many of you are aware of and probably have been involved with in the past. And there are a lot of correlations with higher levels of peace in society, in urban environments. Many of those have to do with basic human needs, which is no surprise to any of us working in this space. But one thing I want to pull out of some of that study, both in the US Peace Index and the Global Peace Index, is that there was a strong correlation between levels of trust social capital, social cohesion, and levels of peace. So more peaceful environments had higher levels of trust, social capital, and social cohesion, unsurprisingly. Where there were higher levels of violence, you had lower levels of trust, social capital, and social cohesion. And I say that because our cities are really leaning into this space more and more, which is great. They were kind of forced to, because after developing climate action plans for many years, they quickly realized that they couldn't enact those plans without a better engagement strategy. You couldn't just tell a community, this is what we're going to do, and assume the community would say, okay, great, sure, let's roll this out. And so cities are having to slow down to speed up. And this is difficult work for cities because a lot of the sustainability staff, the climate staff, are seeing the urgency of now, and we need to act fast to decarbonize our cities, but they're also realizing they can't scale it up unless the community is behind the work. And so I put those links in chat to show the new ways in which some of our cities are engaging communities. And if you read those later, you'll see things like appreciative inquiry processes that David Cooper-Ryder and others at Case Western have rolled out with cities like the city of Cleveland to engage the whole of society, to engage all stakeholders in the community. And you'll see things like resilience hubs, which aren't just superficial infrastructure resilience like power backups and battery and food if you don't have food, and water if you don't have water, which is how resilience hubs have been written on recently. But there's also community programming happening at the resilience hubs to build the social resilience, which is essential for future climate disasters. So I say all this to show that cities in the sustainability space are leaning into this work, so they're ready allies. So I am very interested in violence prevention personally, and helping urban peace building processes in DC and beyond personally. And I'm seeing professionally, our cities are increasingly removing silos that previously stood in the way of partnership and collaboration across city systems. And so there's a real opportunity for continued synergy in this space, so that you see, all of you who are working perhaps in the traditional violence prevention space, or perhaps even gun violence prevention, we start to see sustainability offices and sustainability leads as partners too in the process, because as they lean into the equity and justice work and the reparations work and the resilience work, you're starting to see a lot of crossover with other programs and departments across cities. So this is all good. It is forcing kind of a slowdown, which is also good to build trust and more social capital and social cohesion, but it will serve us well in the future. So that's just a brief bit on some of what our cities are focusing on.
Great, thank you. Thanks for building the bridge there to help us in thinking about, starting to think about what does the sustainability infrastructure have to do with peace building, and even if we think more directly about violence prevention. So we'll move now to our last speaker, Dr. David Ragland, who is a writer, scholar, activist, and friend with a focus on racial justice, reparations, and abolition. He's the co-founder and co-executive director for the Culture Organizing and Reparations at the Truth Telling Project, and is currently the director of the Grassroots Reparations Campaign. He's also a lecturer at Harvard University on reparations. In the aftermath of Michael Brown Jr.'s murder in Ferguson, David joined with Congressman Cori Bush and other activists and founded the Truth Telling Project to help community members control their own narrative, to also document directly the abuses of law enforcement and uplift stories of those who experience police violence, and to work on healing the past and addressing ongoing trauma through truth telling. So I'm very glad that that Dave was able to make it today, and I would like to turn it over to you, Dave. Thanks.
Sure. Hey, y'all. I have an external speaker, so I'm just checking to see if it's working, if folks can hear me. But it's a pleasure to be here. And just, I'm going to drop in a recent article that Trevor Smith and I wrote. It's around reparations and abolition. And just naming that, since Congresswoman Bush and I started the Truth Telling Project in Ferguson, some of our work has sort of extended into supporting communities around the country who are interested in doing truth processes. And that work today looks like, in the past, we've worked with Portland, who was considering a truth process. And one of the things we saw in that process was how the city ended up awarding this process, the groups to facilitate the process, to a group of retired police officers who had never done that work, and then canceled this truth process. And as the city, the people in the city were really interested in a historical reckoning. And then similarly, after the George Floyd protests and the murder of George Floyd in 2020, folks around the country have been demanding something different. And as a result, more than 40 cities around the country announced truth processes, a truth and reconciliation type process, to do historical reckonings and name whether cities were connected to historical harm and how they might address them. And one of the communities that we're working in right now is Iowa City, who has launched a truth and reconciliation process. And is in this beginning, the commissioners are now being trained on how to carry out one. And interestingly, Harvard Divinity School has launched an initiative to train its communities on how to do a truth process. And those are two of the efforts that we're currently involved in addition to reparations efforts around the city, around the country. Communities are looking at truth and reparations to say, look, how do we move forward if we can't address our past? And that's some of the powerful work that I think has implications around peace building. I think reparations are the beginning of a peace treaty or offering for peace. But we have to be careful given the way that peace treaties have played out with this country. So happy to be here, happy to be in conversation.
Thank you. Thanks. I appreciate it, David. I wanted to ask a follow-up question since I can, and you covered a span because your work is really, and the communities, many people who've stepped up to do this work really has spanned nationally. With the reparations work, I think that you've been such a clear voice on the importance of the grassroots reparations. And when in my classes, when I talk to students, for example, a lot of people are thinking about like a congressional bill or something that is going to happen when there's the votes in Congress. So that I think when people hear the term grassroots reparation, doesn't necessarily bring up an image of an actual action or what to do, but you've got a lot of those images and have been involved. So if you could just give us just a glimpse in to what is when you're working with communities, what is grassroots reparations? What does that mean, or how are people experimenting with implementing that?
Sure. I think many people look at reparations as a check, and it's more than a check. The United Nations, after the conference on racism in South Africa, described reparations as a response to gross crimes against human dignity, human rights. And some of the things that they described as reparations as having multiple dimensions that include compensation, obviously, but also restitution, the return of stolen land. And so we saw California and a small community called Bruce Beach return that land to the Bruce family, that essentially the city officials were complicit in running out a Black family who had created a resort, a place for folks to come and rest and have vacation in the early part of the 20th century. And then, one of the things that we've also been sort of examining is the way that more than 30 Black communities after reconstructions were destroyed by their white neighbors. And we saw this, and we can see this in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where one of the last living survivor of the Tulsa massacre where state officials, city officials, and local right residents destroyed a Black community. And these are folks who had saved their dimes doing what we say is the American dream right after enslavement, and built a community for themselves and for their folks. And that whole community was destroyed, and that's happened around the country. And that's part of reparations, that's restitution. Other parts of reparations include education. And that's not just education for Black folk, but education for white Americans and other BIPOC folks in BIPOC communities, understanding that reparations is a moral and material debt that's owed. And it speaks to who we are as a nation, to our very soul. I think the other piece is healing, the kind of healing that's required. And then I think one of the most important parts of reparations is guarantees of non-repeat. How do we not repeat the harm that we continue? And I think peace building is a major part of that. And how is our country educating each other about the ways that we are a part of harm, complicit in harm? We see it just talking about, when Ashton was talking about the ways in which cars and vehicles are used to weaponize that. Recently, folks have used their cars in protest to harm people directly who are protesting against racial justice. And then, like, when I was a PhD student, there was a place where I would cross the street. Sometimes I would sit there to see, who white people would stop for. And, just in my own personal anecdotal experience, I saw that they were less likely to stop at a stop walk for people of color, particularly Black folk and brown folks. So I think, like, peace building is really about addressing the hearts of America. And that's what I think guarantees of non-repeat are about as well. What is our heart like? Can we see Black folk, brown folk as human? I think reparations are really about demanding, for once and for all, abolition. What does that really look like, given that slavery is still, part of, or allowed in many state constitutions? As a matter of fact, prisons are one of the ways, the loopholes that states get to operate prisons or get to use in prisons. And we know that the majority or disproportionate amounts of Black and brown folks are incarcerated in this country. And this country has the largest incarceration rate in the world. And so peace building has to be connected with abolition of institutions that are not about life, but about death. And I think in general, peace building has to be about bringing our economy to expect life, not extraction from people, but life building policies, not funding violence workers. One Brooklyn College sociologist described policing as violence workers. How do we stop violence workers? How do we abolish people who are focused on violence, not on the health and life of our communities?
Thank you. Appreciate it. So I've got 2 pages of notes, and I was fully listening and trying to write at the same time. I'm gonna just offer some kind of reflective pieces and want to open it up for this to be a conversation amongst the panelists, and then with folks who are here with us. And just a couple pieces here. And so with Miss Pat, I really heard about this, the gap between legal frameworks that were created and the realities of how that played out for communities on the ground. And she highlighted this need to agitate, educate, and to organize, and that grassroots action is key. That the legal frameworks themselves are not going to be enough, and that kind of redaction of history needs to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed in part at least, or in large part, by people coming together and doing that education work in a deep community-led kind of way. So I want to just frame that up here, because we're thinking here, right, like about what are peace systems in the city? What could they be? What are they? They already exist. And education seems like one of those systems. And education, when I hear Miss Pat talk, and I think about, even just my own experience, my family's experience, my grandmother was illiterate. She didn't read or write. A lot of that education comes outside the walls of formal schooling. Now, many people, of course, schools are really important sites of education. So community-based education and that kind of community-driven engagement in peacemaking is really important. And that doesn't always look like, that includes agitation, education, and organizing as a key component of that. So that's one piece that we have here in the puzzle. And there's many more that Ms. Pat raised. And Ashton talked about this, how deeply structural in literally like our built spaces and the structures of our city, and then also in our attitudes, some forms of violence are, and how kind of cultural violence works so that we don't even see that as violence. An example of like the accident language. And I think in some ways then transportation holds the potential to be to do the opposite then, in a way, is kind of what I heard. That transportation means an integrated system, and it means access, and it means addressing these transportation hierarchies. So a question there when we think about, so we've got the importance of the education and challenging injustice and doing deep history work in cities, and what would a peace learning system look like there? That was a thought that came when I was listening to Ms. Pat. With Ashton, it's like built into the roads and into our structure of our lives. And so what's possible there? Is this about repurposing that infrastructure? How do we use it to be more connective? Do we need to build parallel infrastructure? Was a question that came up for me, just thinking about this main theme that we have of peace systems. And then Michael talked about his work in sustainability and the work of the city's initiative. And one thing that stood out was that observation that some of these silos between city agencies are breaking down. And so there's some opportunity of that. That may not be the case as much in the peace worker side of it. And so, but on the sustainability side, there's a breaking down of these silos. So I think a question that comes to mind there is what is the opportunity when we think about peace building to kind of to better integrate our efforts and also to kind of leverage that kind of how those silos are breaking down. So I wondered there, Michael, if you had any insights on that. But also with the example of the resiliency centers, I heard, hey, there's some stuff that's right there right now that people are thinking in a specific way about it, environmental resilience, but there's an opportunity to infuse that with a violence prevention, with a kind of justice focus also. And then last, when Dave was speaking about reparations, and he brought it down to this individual level of it kind of being a way of life. That requires an educational process, that reparations is not just about the financial component, though the financial component is very important, that it is a commitment to be able to atone for, look at, address past harm in order to understand why is this happening today? Why do we have the forms of violence that we have today? That it's not a momentary it's not a snapshot of a moment. So I want to turn it over to you all. In a way, the question I want to ask is if any of that sparks some thoughts for you that you want to build on. I'd love to hear more. In a way, I want to ask the question something like, if you were handed the keys or something, or an angel donor cape or whatever the thing is, right? Like you got your people, you had what next level what is needed, and you to do some kind of systematic next level peace work in the city context. What would that mean for you? Where were some of the opportunities? What's possible? what do we need? Who else do we need to call into the work, or is there a way we could move from project-based work to, to the whole citywide type work? So if any of that is enticing to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. I mean, it's not like a solution magic wand, but just yeah, this is how we move to a more integrated approach, a more holistic approach, a less we're going to fund this piece and do this small piece, but start to really to build more holistically.
I can just jump in and say a little bit that I think that a lot of stuff is underway. I think you have city politics, which is, around the country, we see the same kinds of, like people who are really interested in, just the political process and politics in general, and often are stuck and entrenched in those systems. And at the same time, there's always people who are, I think, working and reaching out and trying to make the connections. And I mean, for me, like my entree, for years, probably like right after undergrad, I was deeply involved in, addressing blight in cities, through a financial and political lens. And that work quickly, I guess over the next decade or so turned into just looking at the way that people who were protesting could make changes in communities. And I think in general, and during the Ferguson uprising, we built community infrastructure, a people's infrastructure. We started figuring out the importance of mutual aid and supporting each other. And so I think there are different types of ecologies in communities that are always present. And so one example is, after the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, a group called the Blackout Collective worked to create public housing with the donations that came in. And if you look at what's happening in Boston, for instance, Boston Ujima and the New Economy Coalition, people are creating regenerative systems and working outside of what the state, the city governments are doing, because I think, many of us know that, BIPOC communities are on the front line of climate disaster, and also the front line of violence and occupations by police. Like we see, for instance, police training in Israel, Ferguson police trained in Israel, Minneapolis police trained in Israel. What are they training for? Training how to occupy communities so that they can make a enemy. We saw that recently. New York City police just made $1 million from traffic stops. We see that the city governments are not disavowing themselves from profit made off the backs of people. We saw that in St. Louis, where you could drive from one small municipality and another municipality and probably get stopped 9 to 10 times because, the focus is about extraction. And so in part, smaller ecosystems and communities are changing the way that they're thinking, and they're thinking through a lens of abundance as opposed to scarcity, and a lens of connection as opposed to extraction. And so I think part of it is abolishing the police and the white supremacists in our head that keeps us from connecting with each other and building. And I just can't really, describe the importance of local people who are thinking about their communities as connected to the natural environment and figuring out ways to be with instead of be over. And so for me, I'm thinking about what does a mental shift look like? And what does it look like to really address the harm that communities of color are experiencing, and abolish the entities. And when I say abolish, I mean support social workers and life-giving work as opposed to violence workers.
Thank you. Yeah, floor is open for other folks to comment as well in terms of what you see as the opportunities for building on these systems in cities. So one piece of it here is that there's a lot happening already, and there's a lot to build on in terms of grassroots action already.
Well, I'd like to share that the experience that we've just held in Savannah, you're talking about public squares and on the ground grassroots folks coming together. We're talking about changing a policy that was in place. So this is the first time that the people had access to change something in 140 years. And so I think that alone needs to be examined. And the examination that I would hold is that we had to hold steadfast and immovable that we, the people, own those public places. And so we have an obligation to educate the leadership so that we can make those changes. So our focus was peacemaking and peace building with the actual folks that have the power, which was the government. We wanted them to understand that there are certain things that are going to be negotiated and certain things that are not, but we had to educate them on what is happening in their own city. They had been so surrounded by other generations that told them that was the norm. They had to wake up and understand that this peace building has to do with us saying, catch up with the people. The people are educated. We're trying now to educate government. And so that's what happened. So we have to find some methodologies to wake them up too, because what I have found in the public sector as well as in the prison sector, I've worked with the ACLU as I shared, and I've gone into many state and county jails, over 150 of them. I've been involved with negotiation with the Cuban detainees in the early 80s. And what I know is that when the people get tired, they take over from the government stand or in the criminal justice arena in the prisons. So leadership has to pay attention to that, and they have to come full circle and be willing to be educated to what's going on, because the people are organizing from the ground up now. It's from the ground up. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ms. Pat, is there, because that seems like to be a key piece of it, and that's a bridge too, but between what David just said. Is there things that you've found that are specifically helpful for pushing when there's grassroots a push of government institutions to, in this case, like you're remaking literally public space, and so are there some things that are helpful for that kind of shared governance? And sometimes people who are trying to agitate are locked out of that process. Sometimes even when the door is open, people aren't able to hear. So that itself is kind of an art in getting change made.
Yeah. I mean, I think that you have to put kudos in the fact that we had the support of the reparations project. We have people that are already skilled and encouraged us and said, yes, you can do it. And we knew we had the tools. I'm the policy fellow for them, but we also had a fellow that was in activism. So at any given point, if the city decided we're not going to do business with you, we're ready to go into the next phase, which was activism, which means bodies on the ground. And those young people were ready to be there. So I think it's a culmination of tapping into the resources of people like Ash. I like what you said, Ashton, about your work and what Michael was saying. We have to tap into people that are all around us to do this work. And we're all pushing in and pulling up ground support. And the ground support comes in different forms, but the government has to look around and say, wait a minute, they're ready. So some things are just non-negotiable. And I think when it comes to justice, people get tired you have to organize from the ground up when that happens. And so that's what I believe peace building should be about, from the level of the grassroots level, from the ground up, and wake up the top level. Because again, when people get tired, they take over. I've seen every institution in the criminal justice system. The warden doesn't run the prison. The inmates run the prison, and they allow the guards and the warden to take the administrative authority. But when they get tired, they can take over that prison in 1 hour. That's what I've seen in 30 years. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so yeah, it's building power. The networks are important too. So it's the local and the networks, because it's in some ways it's a power issue, right?
Absolutely.
It's a power issue to have that a good dynamic interplay, you know, between those two. We're gonna hear from Michael, and then I'm glad to see that we're starting to get to some hands raised too. So Bernice, I see you, and you'll be first up when here in a minute. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just suggest something quickly here. So for folks who are familiar with the Carter School, if you would look at our graduates, a lot of those graduates, and I'm one of them, I got my PhD there and I adjunct there occasionally, and a lot of the graduates have gone on to federal government roles in the State Department, in USAID, in the DoD, in the DIA, and a range of federal roles that are relevant and perhaps obvious to the conflict resolution space, to the peace building space. But I do think, and Arthur, you may be building this as we speak at Carter and others, but the work across departments at all subnational government levels too, and even federally, so that our peace building work permeates all aspects of governance. I see still such a divide in the schools and the theories and the trainings. So you could have a whole sustainability team come into a city government and they have no training whatsoever in peace building process and conflict resolution, and they may not think they need it until they get into their work and start doing community engagement and realize, oh crap, I need some help here in terms of building trust, shifting power, things like that. So I do see a real opportunity for Carter and other conflict schools, peace and conflict schools, to grow their programming so that when we're equipping this generation's leaders to go into city government or federal government across a range of departments, education and transportation is just two that were mentioned here, that we're equipping people with a range of skills that are increasingly essential in the work. So I see a real opportunity here in terms of building capacity from our camp, our peace building camp, so that they can work in city and federal government in really effective ways across departments.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, and I think in some ways the conversations in the old school conflict resolution conversations had an imagination of like productive conversation without the power discussion sometimes. And what you're highlighting, what it, you know, is being highlighted so clearly here is like to move change in either actualize it because you're building a parallel system, or push government entities to be involved in that requires shifting power dynamics. And then also those kind of conflict resolution skills help to actually be able to communicate and get that work done too. So thank you, Ashton.
Yeah, if I can piggyback off of
Yes,
what others
please.
have said, as I'm an urban planner by training, and I bet if you ask most urban planners or most people in aligned professions like designers and architects and engineers, they would not see themselves as a peace builder. And so to the extent that people feel empowered to take that role and to see themselves as part of these systems of violence that in many ways we've actually put into our built environment, that's a really powerful first step. I think in terms of concrete ways that folks have started to bridge gaps at the citywide level, I've seen some promising kind of examples of this. So for instance, in London, they appointed a loneliness minister to address the epidemic of loneliness and lack of social cohesion in communities, which is important when you think about how research has shown that telling an elder, for example, they can't drive anymore is as emotionally damaging as a terminal diagnosis. So the fact that we've built our community such that not being able to drive makes you feel like you are life might as well be over as you know it, because we haven't built walkable and livable communities. So the fact that London is taking this approach, they've actually invested in thinking about how transportation networks can serve to connect people and decrease the sense of isolation that we feel. Similarly, in Barcelona, they installed what are called super blocks. So they focused on pedestrian first infrastructure that kind of limited the amount of traffic and vehicles that were coming into and out of, kind of dense urban cores. And they found a connection to mental health and how many people reported feeling safer and more connected to their neighbors. Likewise, in DC, when we put together what's called our high injury network, our Department of Transportation only talked with our Metropolitan Police Department, MPD, to get a sense of where crash reports were filed. But in other cities like San Francisco and Denver, they've actually worked with their departments of health and medical care providers to get a sense of who is actually presenting in emergency rooms with injuries that weren't reported on their kind of standard reporting systems. And therefore, we're able to illustrate the high injury networks where most crashes occur with a lot more accuracy. It was a lot more kind of in line with the lived experience of people who might not be captured by some of the other bureaucratic processes that we've created. And so I think there are opportunities to work across disciplines, and we're starting to see small aspects of it emerge, and hopefully more cities will begin to invite folks from a broad range of disciplines to look at these systems and to see themselves as partners and practitioners of peace building in those conversations.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a kind of different layer than that's important too, is that city design itself can be more inclusive, right? So there's like the building power pushing for changes for institutions that are non-responsive kind of component of it, but then the actual design processes of cities can make it so that there's a lot more dynamic engagement and a lot more transparency and clear avenues for people to get involved. Vernice, the way the settings are, I made you a co-host, so you should see an invite that'll allow you to take yourself off of mute.
Oh my gosh, hi. So my name is Vernice. I'm a recent graduate from George Mason University, and I studied conflict analysis and resolution with a concentration in political and social action and justice and reconciliation. But a lot of the work that I'm really interested in is getting to know people who are directly impacted by the justice system in America. And one of the things that I've really noticed about, especially people my age who have already been like in some way, shape, or form been through the justice system within our country, they do not want to interact with the police whatsoever. But from what I'm finding with a lot of nonprofit organizations is that they're either trying to figure out ways to interact with them in a way that builds that trust, or they're trying to figure out ways to not interact with them at all, in terms of like, because of the community that they work with and understanding that their trust is solely within the community. So that means that like they have to be careful when interacting with other community members, such as the police. What do you guys think about that? Like in your work, is that something that complicates the mission that you're on in terms of, telling the truth and things of that nature? Because I know that Pat has expressed that it really takes work from the ground up in order to form a historical reckoning and in order to really get things done. Because I heard that same thing too, Pat, in high school when we were discussing like world history. It was like some AP class that I took. And she kept saying, like, she just kept saying to us, like, just think of it in simple terms, like when people are hungry, they revolt. And that's why a lot of things have been happening around the world, is because these systems, it just deprives their people. And so their people are getting frustrated. And that's why they're, raising all of these revolutions. But understanding that although it does take a revolution, it also takes community. What do you guys think about that complication in terms of relationships with positions of authority or systemic authority, especially in communities of color and communities in the urban city?
Sister Pat, do you want to go first? I mean, I have some thoughts about this. One of the things that I've learned, and I think that's connected to what Sister Pat and Ashton have shared, is that cities, the architecture of cities have changed since the civil rights movement and even since World War II. If we think about the ways that interstate highways were built with the Eisenhower administration to be able to transport military, and even streets in local communities were widened to transport police and to create more of a military complex or industrial complex. And I think additionally, like even college campuses were changed post civil rights movement to create multiple ways to get into campus so you can avoid seeing, for instance, the protests that were happening. And even the cost of school increased to prevent more people from being able to access education, which is why we're seeing massive amounts of debt. So I think while it's important to be in conversation, or somebody be in conversation, during the civil rights movement, SNCC organizers, each in our movement, various individuals were assigned to be in communication with their counterparts in the police infrastructure, because it was really, part of it is survival, was really an urgent and still is an urgent proposition. But I think one of the realizations that's come to us, is how much we offer consent to policing groups, and how little reform has changed. For instance, I was talking about the Portland Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the ways that police operatives were deployed to disrupt that process. And they wanted a truth process for police before the citizens got to tell their truth. And then they influenced the city government to give them this contract, which when the media found out that no one who had experience with truth and reconciliation or transitional justice were involved in that organization that was supposed to do a truth process, the whole thing was canceled. And so I think that it is an asymmetrical power relationship when dealing with groups like police who don't, we're seeing the way that unions across the board are being impacted, except for police unions. So they are not acting as members of our communities. And so how do you do that? And for me, I think part of it is, what are the systems that support people, as opposed to systems that support groups that support and protect the elite? I mean, look at who police. They police lower socioeconomically impacted communities, as opposed to wealthy communities where they serve mostly as security guards. And so the communities that are doing, there's a number of communities. I can't remember where I was, but I was somewhere and they were just implementing a hotline for non-emergency calls. And these are some of the ways that local communities are engaging. Those are some of the ways that I prefer. And I think that, yeah, it's complex. Like, we want police to be our neighbors, but many of them don't live in the urban centers where they are charged with policing, and they don't see themselves as a part of our communities, nor do they want to hold power with. Even often we do restorative justice circles. I had to quit doing it with police because they would come in with their gear and intimidate the people. And so not only are protest ways of disrupting people whose sole form of interacting is violence, but there are other ways as well. There are ways of, I think, requiring accountability where unions can collectively and at a leadership level demand that police unions behave in certain ways. We see this in New York City where educators and other groups are having their wages cut, and the only union members who aren't are police. And so, like, I think if some police can ask other police to join the ranks of humanity again, and use policing for very small pieces as opposed to this hammer, a blunt hammer for everything in our communities. So just look at the ways that police are deployed in communities of color and lower socioeconomic communities versus middle class, white, and wealthy communities, and you'll see that there's real need to try some other approaches outside of working with violence workers.
Thank you, David. Ms. Pat, did you want to add to that about the question too about kind of mistrust that can come up in truth-telling work at the community level?
Just a little bit. I think Dave covered most of what I was thinking. I wanted to say that the leadership and the ability for the grassroots communities to select leadership and give them a mandate, an agenda on criminal justice reform, for example. In Savannah, we intentionally selected an African-American leader to run our county government, which was 6 different cities. The budget was very large for criminal justice reform in terms of his police and all of that. And one of the things that we said is that we want to retrain the police force. And so in Savannah right now, if you're a Chatham County sheriff, a deputy sheriff, you have cultural diversity training and all of that, but you have to actually come downtown to the Civil Rights Museum. And before they're sworn in, through all the things they go through, they have to go into the civil rights courses. I'm working right now so they can come down to the river and learn about slavery and freedom. I want officers to understand their population. 64% of the community here is African American. And I want them to be trained in how to address and approach people of color in terms of a cultural end. Because the surveys that we conducted before we even selected leadership showed that 65% of the officers they were hiring were ex-military. And so you're talking about ex-military officers coming into communities of color and thinking that we're their soldiers. So it was a lot to consider, but I would say don't forget about looking at leadership so that you give them an agenda. You give them their report cards to say, if you don't do this and that, we're not going to reelect you. We're sick and tired of being sick and tired. So think about putting a potpourri bowl together, and it's like the community and our opportunity to choose new leadership, put new mandates on them. Do not continue to elect people who do not handle their business for the people. So I think that I would add that to what Dave said in terms of from the ground up again, select the right leadership and put demands on leadership for changes and do your homework in terms of what's going on. What are the numbers? Put the numbers together as well so you can tell them exactly what you need for your communities.
Thank you. Thank you, Lena. I made you a co-host, so you can unmute your mic. You should be able to.
Yes, thank you. I'm just want to share with you like my experience in Colombia. I'm a fellow here, and I'll be here just for a couple of months. And I work directly with civil society organizations, with grassroots organizations. And my last experience was working with organizations that were working with migrants from Venezuela to prevent the human rights violations. And something important that we made there was, first of all, work with those organizations, but at the same time, we create different local networks where the people that was talking about the migration, they have the possibility to create different tools, like in communications, technical tools, workshops with the communities to engage and empower the people to prevent all that kind of human rights violations, but at the same time, promote inclusion and prevent violence, because most of the people that were there, they have like a lot of problems with the host communities because the conflict, because they were also victims of the guerrilla groups, etc. So the important thing was that we have the opportunity to work with them, and at the same time try to put them with government persons like in contact, and we made like a governance inside the local communities. So when I was at the university doing my master, my work was related about governance. How can we sit the different stakeholders in the same table to prevent something in the territory? So I think that is a good way to work and prevent violence and build peace in the territories.
Thank you. That's helpful and really connects really well with what Ms. Pat shared as well, with creating local governance structures and those networks. Any of the panelists want to comment, build on that? So I think as we start to move towards our close, here, you know, there's a couple of things are sticking out in my mind. Even this notion of a violence worker, and of course here we're talking about those who are doing peace work, who are trying to do healing related work, and to work on environmental sustainability and other issues. So those systems, even violence work, is supported by systems, right? It's not possible just only at the individual level. And similarly, if we think about even just violence prevention in the city, oftentimes the approach to violence prevention in the city is very piecemeal, right? The short-term grants, people call it a long grant, right? If it's 2 years or 3 years that the funding came in for, right? Which is really kind of a short time period. The funding is and efforts are often project-based, and groups kind of change over time. If we were to think about water, for example, in the city, it would be ineffective to try to have healthy drinking water as a result of short-term grants with organizations that are changing all the time and without a systematic coverage. So there's a number of levels that come to mind from this conversation. One is that really important individual level work. That truth telling was one of the examples that was given of looking at the nature of violence, of understanding how it's played out historically, and understanding how it's impacted us differently, and then trying to make change based on that understanding of what does it mean to align oneself with life, to try to repair what has been broken, and to address these inequalities that are in our cities and in our country. So that's a really important level. Then I'm hearing from you all the importance of local community and local networks and organizing to build a parallel structure, even something like I'm sorry, Ashton, I think you called it the bus taxi or the bike taxi or something. So a bunch of people, right, have to collaborate for that. You have local organizing, can get children to school without reliance on cars. It can help identify community members who might be left out. That requires that local, highly localized action. Then there's the importance of the networks. And Ms. Pat talked about that with truth telling. The networks can provide support. It's a wider range of allies. It helps shift the power dynamic. A number of things that are highlighted there. So this is part of this peace infrastructure, right? So we have that local efforts, then layered, we have this, they're in these wider networks, and we certainly have opportunities. Movements have always been networked, but in this day and age with the communication infrastructure and other things, we have these networks. And then there's dealing with the city, like the city government, and then literally like the built infrastructure of the city, right? That's really fixed and in place in many levels, and trying to influence city government, and open it up, make it more transparent, accountable, and push city government, and literally also work to change the infrastructure, which many people don't see as a complete given, right? It's just like the background of the movie. It's the stage. But in fact, we see that peace workers are also part of the peace work is literally reworking our built space in our infrastructure. So I think this thank you, Bike Bus, paints a picture of when we're thinking about, if we think about a peace worker, we go back to that individual level. And part of what we hear today is that a peace worker can look like a lot of things, right? A peace worker can look like a lot of things. We need to also then be thinking about how do we support those peace workers with local communities, with networks, with some durable support that can help sustain that work and link that work up. And so I think a piece that's in here, and Michael, you mentioned this about the associational life. I think you said social cohesion has been big in those studies. Is that connecting people who are doing the work, and sustaining work through those connections. So I think I want to thank you all. Thank you for the question, and thank each of the panelists for giving us a number of different levels to think about it when we think about peace in the city. If we're going to have supported peace workers, if we're going to have a city that's a life affirming and where the systems pull in that direction, you've given us some layers to different levels to work on. People who are in the room who we didn't hear from, you're working across those different levels already. So please, like I said, feel free to stay in touch about any kind of ideas that this has sparked for you, and ways that we might be able to support taking your work to the next level, or learning together about it. And I just wanted to open it up to each of the panelists if you have any closing thought or anything that you'd like to share before we close out.
The only thing I'll say quickly is just thank you again for joining this conversation, to all the folks who signed in and signed on, and thanks Arthur for hosting, and hopefully one takeaway amid and among the many takeaways for folks is the complexity of the work and the comprehensive nature of the work, so that we're seeing urban peace building in many, many ways, perhaps not just the traditional ways too, because we need it across all city departments. So hopefully that was one takeaway for folks.
Good. Does anyone else want to share?
Mm. Same thing. I just want to echo appreciation for everyone coming to hear us, and thank you for putting this panel together. Really excited to be in connection with all the folks here. Yeah, thank you all.
And I'd also like to say thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm always excited about meeting new people and learning what's happening in other parts of the country and finding out that we all have kindred spirits to do this powerful work. I would say what the philosophy of the ACLU still is, my comrades there. We must always remember to be guardians of our freedom. And so I think if we can do that, then we will all stay awake so we can move forward for new generations. So thank you for this opportunity, Arthur. Thank you so much. You and Dave. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just add onto the heap of thanks. Thank you all for being in conversation. It was an honor to be alongside you and to learn from you. I think maybe the only other thing that I would close with is I feel like our conversation for me was really helpful because it, even though this was titled systems, I think behind every individual system is an enabling, or excuse me, behind every individual decision is an enabling system, and behind every enabling system is an individual decision. And so it really highlighted the fact that our systems are made up of, we often think of, is it structures or is it individuals? And I think really it is everything and all inclusive. And I've been grateful to my fellow panelists to really highlight that tension is a false kind of dichotomy, and that there's more connection between them than meets the eye. So thank you for the work that you're doing, and thanks to everyone for being here and being an engaged audience, and to Arthur for excellent facilitation as usual.
Well, thank you all. Please stay in touch with us at the Program for Urban Peacebuilding. Thank you to our panelists. This was an excellent discussion, and for everybody who made the time to be here. We will post the video in a couple weeks and hope to see you again.